Hi everyone, so this is our second lesson on learning what came before us, how to establish our own course in life. Our statement of inquiry for June. So we began the lesson by reviewing what we've done so far together. So in our very first session, we began by looking at the immune system and how our body defends us. We then went on to learn about life in the past, namely ancient Greece in our second lesson. We made leaflets / brochures inviting people to visit us in ancient Greece. If you recall, as our title, we had something like, come to Greece, come and visit our renowned Olympics event, that kind of thing. So this allowed us to get a better understanding of what life was actually like in ancient Greece. So that was our objective behind that task, so that we can then move on to consider how they may have dealt with disease outbreaks, pandemics, plagues, and epidemics in the past, and how we compare to that. So that's what we'll be starting today. We'll be looking at the basis of early medicine. So we'll be moving forward from that street. Disease outbreaks have devastated humanity, sometimes changing the course of history, and at times signaling the end of entire civilizations. So do you think that the world was prepared for the COVID-19? So that's our new line of investigation. That's our line of investigation for the coming sessions. So what do you think, guys? Really consider this question for a while and hold your thought on it, as we'll be revisiting this idea in the coming sessions. So learning about early medicine and past responses will allow us to put this question into context and relate to it better. So how well prepared are we, and why? Why would you say we're well prepared? So that's the kind of thing I'd like you to think about and to hold that thought for our coming sessions. So our learning journey starts with that person we talked about in our last session. So that's Hippocrates. What do you remember about him? What do you remember we talked about? Who was he? So we learned more about this today. And I'd like to go into detail about this, about our discussion, so that you can watch this over and review our learning on Hippocrates and on early medicine. So to start our story of early medicine, let's revisit ancient Greek life. So that's number one. Many people in ancient Greece were quite poor. So if you take a look at this first image over here, they were quite poor. And think back to the 6 pillars of civilization. One of them is social groupings. We shall soon learn how important it is for civilizations to manage all sections of society. So a lot of people in ancient Greece were quite poor. So if you take a pause, if you look at this image over here, so we've got at the bottom here, poor, slave, trader. So they were quite poor. They often moved to towns from the countryside, had little money, and lived in quite cramped conditions. So the house we saw in our last session, that's quite a spacious middle-class home. The poor usually shared a room with a lot of other people or with a large family. So they did mostly heavy and quite dirty work that kept the towns running. So all the while, if you take a look, the more wealthy members of Greek society educated themselves. Many of these were Greek thinkers. Indeed, we still know of and revere many Greek thinkers and philosophers like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Homer, as well as Hippocrates, as we talked about in our last lesson. We still read their books even today. So even today, their books are widely available. So a great deal of literature, and indeed the English language itself, comes from ancient Greece, just as we discussed in our last lesson. So these thinkers, they spent their day just thinking about ideas on how the world worked. And one of these believed that doctors should help people. And he came up, so Hippocrates was interested in medicine. He believed that doctors should work to help people. And so he came up with the Hippocratic Oath, which is that doctors should work to help and benefit people. They shouldn't harm people. And doctors still take this oath today. He also questioned the prevailing belief at the time that the gods cause sickness. And the Greeks believed that they became sick because they had essentially displeased the gods, and they would go about making offerings, gifts, to appease them, to please them, so that their illness would go away. But Hippocrates was not satisfied with this. He believed that there must be a scientific explanation, and he went to work, go about finding it. So number 2, he encouraged actually his student doctors to observe patients and record their changing condition and symptoms. This was the earliest form of diagnosis, and diseases were actually written down for the first time at this point. So Hippocrates used his scientific knowledge of the 4 elements at the time to come up with the 4 humours. So the 4 elements, guys, do you remember? That's earth, fire, water, and air. So he came up with the 4 humours, which he also matched with the seasons. So these were 4 substances in the body that needed to be balanced. And when they were not, we became sick. He thought that an excess of phlegm in winter made us ill, and an excess of bile in autumn is what made us ill. So he discovered that we needed to maintain balance in our bodies and draw out excess humours to restore the balance so as to cure illness. So one of the ways that they would do this was to withdraw excess phlegm from the body or withdraw excess blood from the body. This was the earliest idea on the natural cause and cure of disease, rather than it being caused and cured by the gods. So Hippocrates, Hippocrates had rejected this by introducing his ideas, which were widely accepted then, and for years to come after that. By doing that, he signaled a huge change. That's the significance of his discovery, is that he signaled a huge change in medical progress and understanding. He essentially caused a move away from superstition and began a culture of scientific inquiry. So essentially, he moved away from superstition and opened the doors for a culture of scientific inquiry. He also transferred this idea of balance to other areas of health, such as healthy living and a balanced lifestyle. Everything in balance, nothing in excess. This is quite advanced thinking. So right here, this is quite advanced thinking and could result in a healthier society, which is actually better placed and better able to respond to disease outbreaks. So in the context of our line of investigation, is better placed to respond to disease outbreaks. So Hippocrates' ideas carried forward for 2,000 years. That's an awfully long time, which is great because he signaled an age of science and inquiry, but it was also to lead to an important lesson, which is something we'll learn more about. And that is that we must always learn from the past whilst further developing past ideas and discoveries so as to progress. Otherwise, we might digress, go backwards, as it were. So what do you think is happening today? Are we constantly progressing? And especially at this point in time? Or are we not? Could we do better? How? Are we progressing or digressing? Think on this idea for the time being, and we will revisit it. So Hippocrates' ideas again were carried forward into the Roman period. So once Greek civilization fell, so in our next section, guys, we will look at how a disease outbreak plays a huge part in the end of their civilization. So this takes us back to our statement of inquiry, that disease outbreaks have sometimes, back to our line of investigation, that disease outbreaks have sometimes signaled the end of civilizations, but not necessarily. Other factors are also, we'll see, that's not necessarily the case. Other factors are also at play in this, as we will learn in our next session. Some civilizations actually prospered following disease outbreaks as they came together and united themselves. So it came as an opportunity. Do you think we might be doing that with COVID-19 today? So let's revisit these ideas again. So let's revisit these ideas. So Hippocrates' ideas were carried forward into the Roman period, as we were saying, and a man named Galen, so they carried forward 2,000 years, and a man named Galen, he studied and wrote down Hippocrates' ideas, and he added to these. So essentially, the human body is perfect, and it must be designed by God. So he added his own ideas that only a great being like God could be responsible for everything about our bodies, and for this balance that Hippocrates wrote about. So by this, though, guys, could he have taken scientific understanding backwards? That's the question I would like you to consider. And we shall see that the way a society or civilization is run or controlled, again, plays a crucial role in how well they might deal with a disease outbreak. Okay, so the civilization itself does affect how well we might deal with a disease outbreak. So going back to the ancient Greeks, the poor in society, in every sector of society, becomes a factor when dealing with disease outbreaks. So guys, move forward with this idea. With Galen, did he actually take scientific understanding backwards? And so guys, many years later in the Dark Ages, after the Roman Empire fell, the Catholic Church held on to Galen's ideas. Okay, why? Because he attributed all his findings to God. The church liked this. They didn't want anyone challenging the church's power and control, and they stifled any scientific inquiry. So great minds like Galileo, as you mentioned in lesson, they were jailed. This is important. It allows us to see that power, greed, and control can hinder progress. So this becomes quite a factor in times of disease, in times of disaster. So when the Black Death hit Europe at that time, no new medical or scientific advancements had been made. They had held on to an age-old idea that had been put forward by Hippocrates, and that which Galen had carried forward. So a rise in urbanization at that time in the Dark Ages also meant that people had moved away from the countryside to the city. And overpopulation, overcrowdedness, unsanitary and unhygienic conditions, a poorly run city with no proper sewage system. Even though, guys, they had a proper sewage system in ancient Greece, which was many years before that. So again, guys, an example of digression. Yeah, it's really important how a country is run, how a civilization is run. That's an important concept, guys. And we can see a recurring pattern here in terms of overcrowdedness and unsanitary conditions. So that's something that, if it had been researched, may well have improved the way that they responded to the Black Death, guys. Because the Black Death essentially wiped out half of Europe's civilization because of these conditions, okay? Because they hadn't come up with any new responses. So it wasn't able to respond to the disease that, essentially was thought to have entered Europe through a ship from Asia. Guys, I'd like you to think about how things could have been different before we look at this more in our next session. But for now, your first task is to essentially use this image and answer these three questions. Answer these three questions, guys. Explain why the ancient Greeks made progress in medicine. Yeah, so essentially, because of this new development. Describe and explain this new development. Describe and explain Hippocrates' discoveries. This is the new development, essentially. And explain the significance of Greek ideas. So how was this important? Yeah, so it was important because it led to a change of thinking, scientific inquiry. And again, what did it mean in terms of the future? What did it mean in the Dark Ages, guys? So what can be the drawbacks of not taking ideas forward? So that's something that you might also want to touch upon. So guys, follow the flowchart through for this. And I've also uploaded guidance for you on your task sheet on our Google Classroom. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and see you next session.